It's 2:47 in the morning. A teenage boy is crouched beside a locked propeller plane on a dark, empty runway in Washington state. No license, no training, no instructor. Just a backpack, a picked lock, and a head full of knowledge stolen from a video game. He climbs in. Fingers move across the instrument panel without hesitation. The engine roars to life. He taxis to the runway, pushes the throttle forward, and pulls back on the yoke. The wheels leave the ground. A 17-year-old kid with a criminal record and 0 flight hours just stole a plane. And by the time anyone notices it's gone, he's already 200 miles away, invisible, crossing state lines at 5,000 feet in the dark. This is the story of Colton Harris-Moore, the Barefoot Bandit, the most wanted teenager in American history. A boy who taught himself to fly in the woods, stole 5 planes, outsmarted the FBI for 2 years, and almost made it to freedom on a tropical island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But before we talk about the planes, we need to talk about the boy. Because nothing about Colton Harris-Moore makes sense unless you understand where he came from. And where he came from was the kind of childhood that doesn't show up in motivational speeches or college application essays. It shows up in case files, in social services reports, in the kind of paperwork that people shuffle around until someone eventually gets hurt. Colton grew up on Camano Island, a rural stretch of land about 50 miles north of Seattle, Washington. It sounds beautiful on paper. Forests, coastline, quiet roads. And it was beautiful for the tourists, for the weekend vacationers, for the families who came to escape the city. For Colton, it was something entirely different. His mother, Pam Kohler, struggled with alcoholism for most of his childhood. His father was not in the picture. There's no stable income, no consistent meals, no sense that the next day was going to be better than the last. By the time Colton was 8 years old, he had already learned how to steal food from grocery stores. Not because he was curious or impulsive, but because he was genuinely, literally, hungry. Teachers at his school noticed the signs. Dirty clothes, bruises that weren't explained, a kid who came to class looking like he hadn't slept in days. The system was made aware. Nothing meaningful changed. By the time he was 12, he had his first arrest, theft. By 13, he was regularly breaking into the vacation homes that sat empty for most of the year on Camano Island. He wasn't stripping them for valuables to sell. He was looking for warmth, for food, for a place where no one would scream at him or worse. Those empty houses with their stocked refrigerators and dry beds were the closest thing to safety he had ever known. At 14, the state sent him to a juvenile detention facility. He lasted 3 weeks before escaping. And what he did next tells you everything you need to know about who Colton Harris-Moore really was. Most kids in this situation would run towards something familiar, a friend's house, a relative, anywhere that felt human. Colton ran into the forest, the Pacific Northwest wilderness, dense, old-growth trees, near constant rain, temperatures that drop fast and cold. He was 14 years old and he chose the woods over everything else because the woods were safer than the world he had been handed. He stayed out there for months. He built shelters. He learned which plants were edible. He studied how to move without leaving tracks, how to stay dry in Washington rain, how to sleep in the cold without losing body heat. He would disappear for weeks at a time, completely invisible to the island's police department despite the fact that they knew exactly where he had to be. Then he would slip into a vacant home, eat everything in the kitchen, sleep in a real bed, shower for the first time in weeks, and vanish before morning. Sometimes he left behind chalk drawings on the walls, small sketches, little messages, his way of saying, "I was here. I exist. You didn't catch me." The locals started calling him the boy in the woods. The police kept searching. Colton kept disappearing. This is where the planes come in. Scattered across Camano Island and the surrounding rural areas of Washington state were small private airstrips. Not major airports with towers and radar and security personnel. Just flat patches of pavement, a few hangars, and propeller planes sitting unlocked and unguarded like they were waiting for someone to notice them. Colton noticed them. He started slipping into the hangars at night, not to steal anything, just to sit in the cockpit, to study. Pilots often left their flight manuals in the seat pocket or tucked into the side door, the same way drivers leave their registration in the glove compartment. Colton took those manuals into the woods and read them by flashlight. He memorized procedures, checklists, the names and functions of every instrument in the cockpit. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, heading indicator, fuel gauge. He didn't have a teacher explaining these things to him. He had stolen documents, a flashlight, and years of accumulated patience from living alone in the wilderness. And then he found the computer. In 2006, while breaking into a vacation home whose owners were away for an extended trip, Colton discovered a PC with Microsoft Flight Simulator installed. He sat down in front of that screen and did not get up for 16 hours. He flew takeoffs, practiced landings, crashed, reset, and flew again. He wasn't playing a game, he was studying. He matched what he saw on the simulator to the procedures in the stolen manuals. He practiced emergency scenarios, engine failures, crosswind landings, dead stick glide approaches. He came back to that house for days. The owners returned to find nothing missing. No damage, no sign of entry except for a little food gone from the pantry. What they could not have known was that a teenage fugitive had just given himself several hundred hours of flight training in the living room. By the time Colton finally sat down in a real cockpit, he had not actually flown a plane, but he had flown the idea of one so many times, so completely, that the gap between simulation and reality had narrowed in his mind to something he believed he could cross. And he was right. The first theft happened in the early morning hours of a day in 2008. The target was a Cessna 182, a 4-seat, single-engine plane, one of the most common private aircraft in the world. Colton picked the lock on the door, climbed in, worked through his memorized startup checklist, and taxied onto the runway without clearance, without permission, without a single other person knowing what he was about to do. The takeoff was rough, but it worked. He pulled back on the yoke at the right moment. The wheels came up. The plane climbed. He leveled off somewhere around 5,000 feet and turned east, flying through darkness toward the Idaho border. Below him, Washington state slept completely unaware that a stolen aircraft was crossing its sky. About 300 miles later, as dawn began to color the horizon, Colton began looking for a place to land. He couldn't use a real airport. Real airports had people, records, identification requirements. He scanned the terrain below until he spotted an old abandoned airstrip. overgrown and cracked, but flat enough. He reduced throttle, set up his descent, came in too fast, corrected, bounced hard on the pavement, skidded into the grass at the edge of the strip, and stopped just before the tree line. He sat there for a moment listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Then he grabbed his backpack and walked into the forest. By the time Washington state authorities found the plane 6 hours later, Colton was already 40 miles away. He had flown himself out of one state's jurisdiction and into another's. Idaho police had no idea he existed. He had no car to track, no credit card to trace, no gas station receipt to place him at a specific location. He had simply vanished from one state and reappeared in another, and the only evidence he had ever been there was a slightly battered Cessna sitting sideways in a field. The plan wasn't complicated. Didn't need to be. When police in one state got too close, steal a plane and fly to the next state. Start fresh. A new hunting ground, a clean slate, another few weeks of freedom. Colton repeated this method again and again over the following 18 months. Washington to Idaho, Idaho to South Dakota, South Dakota to Indiana. Each time, a different plane. Each time, a crash landing in a remote area. Each time, Colton walking away from the wreckage and disappearing before law enforcement could organize a response. The FBI started paying attention after the second or third aircraft theft. The pattern was too specific to be coincidence. Teenage male suspect, rural airports, single-engine planes, crash landings far from populated areas. Someone was using stolen aircraft as escape vehicles and doing it with just enough skill to survive every single landing. They gave him a name, the Barefoot Bandit, a reference to the fact that security footage from some of the break-ins showed him moving without shoes. The nickname stuck. It spread. By 2010, Colton Harris-Moore was on the cover of newspapers. His face was being shared across the internet. People were writing about him the way you write about folk heroes, with a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and something that felt uncomfortably close to affection. The FBI was not amused. By the summer of 2010, the net was closing. Every rural airfield in the Pacific Northwest and Midwest had been put on alert. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states were actively coordinating. The Barefoot Bandit had become a full federal manhunt, and Colton, who had survived on nothing but instinct and self-taught skill for the better part of 3 years, knew it. So he made the most insane decision of his life. He was going to fly to the Bahamas. In July 2010, at a small airport outside Indianapolis, Indiana, Colton broke in one more time. But this wasn't the same as before. He wasn't stealing a plane to hop to the next state. He had found a Cessna 400 Corvalis, a high-performance single-engine aircraft with a full fuel tank and the range to cover serious distance. He had done the math in his head, the way you do when you've spent years teaching yourself things that no school ever offered to teach you. More than 1,000 miles of ocean separated Indiana from the Bahamas if you flew the right route. The Cessna 400 could technically make it if the tank was full. The weather cooperated, and nothing went wrong. Nothing was guaranteed to cooperate. Everything had a chance of going wrong. Colton did it anyway. He took off into the night, pointing the nose southeast. Overland for the first couple of hours, city lights and highway grids visible below. Then the Florida coastline appeared, and then, just like that, it was gone, replaced by black water. The Atlantic Ocean, infinite, and dark and absolutely indifferent to whether a teenage fugitive with no navigation equipment made it across or didn't. He had no GPS, no communication with air traffic control, no weather updates, no one on the other end of a radio who knew where he was. He was navigating by compass and dead reckoning, the same way the earliest pioneering aviators had done it a century before him, before electronics, before satellites, before any of the technology that modern pilots rely on completely. For 5 hours, the only sound was the engine. The fuel gauge dropped in slow, steady increments. He did the math again. And again. He thought he had enough. He was pretty sure he had enough. The sun began rising ahead of him, painting the water gold. And then, on the horizon, low and green and impossibly real, the islands appeared. The Bahamas. He had actually crossed the Atlantic Ocean alone, at night, in a stolen plane, navigating by compass. And he was still alive. He needed to land without using an airport. Customs officials at any real airstrip would arrest him the moment he stepped off the plane. He spotted a beach on the eastern side of Great Abaco Island. Long, flat, empty. He lined up his approach, dropped altitude, and brought the plane in over the sand. The wheels touched down and immediately sank. Soft beach sand does not behave like asphalt. The nose dipped forward with terrible speed. The propeller struck the sand and shattered. The plane skidded, tilted hard, and buried itself nose first into the beach before shuddering to a stop. Colton pushed open the door and stepped out into warm, tropical air. Waves, salt, palm trees. He had crash-landed a stolen plane on a Bahamian beach after flying through the night across 1,000 miles of open ocean. He was 19 years old. He was alive. He was, technically, outside American jurisdiction. He thought he was free. He was not free. Within minutes of the crash, local residents had spotted the wreckage and called Bahamian authorities. Within 2 hours, those authorities had received a complete package from the FBI. Photos, fingerprints, criminal history, a detailed profile of exactly who they were looking for, and exactly how dangerous he was considered to be. The Bahamas is not the Pacific Northwest. There are no vast forests to disappear into, no remote mountain ranges where a man can live unseen for months. Great Abaco Island is roughly 70 miles long, surrounded on all sides by ocean, and populated by people who know their neighbors and notice strangers. Colton had traded his greatest advantage, terrain he knew better than anyone, for an island where he knew nothing and everyone knew everything. He spent the first night hiding in the brush near the beach. By the next morning, he was hungry enough to make mistakes. He broke into a house. The owner returned early and called the police immediately. Now the entire island knew he was there. Roadblocks went up. Boat traffic was monitored. Tourists started posting on social media about the famous American fugitive hiding somewhere among them, turning the manhunt into something halfway between a news event and a game. The net tightened faster than anything Colton had ever experienced. This wasn't law enforcement spread thin across 5 states. This was a single small island being systematically searched by people who were very motivated to find one specific person. By the 3rd day, cornered and desperate, Colton made his final move. At 3 in the morning on July 11th, 2010, he found a speedboat docked at a marina. The owner had left the keys in the ignition. Colton took it and pushed the throttle wide open, racing out into the dark water toward any other island, any distance at all from the police, who were now only hours behind him. The Bahamian police launched pursuit boats immediately. Faster boats, with lights and sirens and officers who knew these waters. Colton pushed his stolen speedboat to its maximum speed, watching the pursuit lights in his wake, doing the same calculation he had done in plains and forests for years. How much distance do I have? How long can I hold it? Where can I go that they can't follow? He had no answers this time. He had not checked the fuel before leaving the marina. The engine began to cough. Then it sputtered. Then it died. The boat sat motionless in the dark water. The pursuit lights came closer. Surrounded. Loudspeakers. Voices ordering him not to move. Colton Harris-Moore stood on the deck of a dead speedboat in the middle of the Bahamian Ocean and understood for the first time in years that there was nowhere left to go. He was extradited to the United States. He pleaded guilty to federal charges related to the aircraft thefts, the burglaries, and the crimes committed across multiple states. He was sentenced to 6.5 years in federal prison. He was released in 2016. He was 25 years old. He had started running at 12. He had survived the wilderness, taught himself to fly from a video game, stolen 5 planes, crash-landed every single one of them, and walked away, crossed the Atlantic Ocean alone at night with nothing but a compass, and stayed one step ahead of the entire American federal law enforcement apparatus for 2 years. He did all of it with no money, no education, no support system, no one in his corner. Was it worth it? That's not a question anyone can answer for him. What we can say is this: the same mind that memorized cockpit instruments from stolen manuals in a dark forest, the same instincts that kept a teenager alive for months in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, the same stubborn refusal to accept that the world he was born into was the only world available to him, those things were real. They were extraordinary. They were just pointed in the only direction that had ever been left open to him. Sometimes a story doesn't have a lesson. Sometimes it's just the account of what one person was capable of when everything else had already been taken away.